Quote, new metal makes my stomach turn. Don't blame that poo-poo on us. Blame it on their mothers. Do you think I listen to any of that stuff at all? No. It's for 13-year-old morons. Believe me, we'll all be laughing about new metal in a couple of years. Heck, I'm actually laughing at it now. End quote. Mike Patton criticizing new metal in 2002. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you may have inferred from that, we're talking about some new metal, but we're talking about the oldest new metal there is, and that's Korn's 1994 self-titled album, Korn. With me, as always, are Tracy Newport, manager of spreadsheets and exterminator of avians. How are you, Tracy?
Doing pretty good. Day off from exterminating avians, so just managing some spreadsheets instead.
Fuck yeah. And then the Reverend Ben Lindsay is with me. Also been on this ride as long as I have. How are you, Ben?
I am doing great, although I think that Mike Patton doth protest too much.
I do too. We're going to talk about that. I think new metal, once it became a pejorative, how people, like, everything flipped. We'll get into all that.
100%. 2002 is very different than 1994.
Correct. I agree. And he sure as shit didn't mind performing with, like, on the Sepultura track, right? Yeah. Remember, he's on that track with, isn't it Corey Taylor?
I think so.
Jump the fuck up?
No, it may actually be Jonathan Davis. No, I think it's Jonathan Davis.
I don't remember, but I will say before we introduce Gabe that
we have to
new metal is a direct derivation from Faith No More. Maybe not Mr. Bungle so much, but Faith No More very much so.
Yeah, I think that's true. With us again, and I'm very glad to have him, is Gabe Cooper. Gabe, how are you tonight?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Let's I guess learn some stats. What are we getting into here, Ben?
So this is the debut album by Korn, self-titled, released on October 11th of 1994. Recorded in Indigo Ranch Studios in Malibu, California, released on Immortal Epic, produced by Ross Robinson. Has a runtime of 65 minutes and 45 seconds. The band is Jonathan Davis on vocals and bagpipes, Brian Head Welch on lead and rhythm guitars, vocals and backing vocals, Jay Monkey Schaefer on rhythm and lead guitars, Reginald Fieldy Arvizu on bass, and David Silvera on drums, with Judith Keener coming in to do the lullaby at the end of the track, Daddy.
The only thing I will add to that is it was actually most of it was not recorded in Indigo Ranch Studios. It was recorded outside of,
yes.
Which I did not know until preparing for this podcast. I'm like, they recorded the shit outside, but they did.
They did. And as a matter of fact, that led to some very cool things. Like on the second track, there's a loud clunk sound, which is actually just one of the guitar cables smacking up against a mic stand, which is, I did not know what that was. I actually thought that was somebody hitting a drum until I read the production notes. But yeah,
that's where Sean Craven, from something I got the idea to just bang a beer keg every so often.
Yeah. Can we pause for a moment to talk about this what the fuck level cover here, which
Sure.
I'd kind of forgotten about. Like I had the album on CD and I of course saw it, but I also didn't have a child this age at the time. So this is a thing. And I also, I have to admit, had not noticed that she's hanging from the letter K.
Yeah, in the shadow.
Ugh. And what is he holding? Horseshoes? Razor blades? I can't even tell what the fuck those are.
I don't know. It could be claw hands, anything. Yeah, there's no telling. I mean,
claw hands. It's just normal,
It's just normal claw. It's just
regular claw hands.
Just Edward Scissored hands. That's
regular claw hands. No, leave it to Gabe to cut through the bullshit. They're just claws. But holy shit, is this album cover devastating?
Well, it matches a lot of the thematics inside, honestly.
It does.
So.
Yeah, I didn't really. This is my first time listening to them, so I never from start to finish really.
That's interesting. Did you pick this? Why did you pick it then? If you
well, I've heard a lot of Korn, especially recently. I've just through my normal listening habits, I end up hitting Life is Peachy. God, let me look.
Follow the Leader.
Untouchables. I've listened to the Nothing a couple of times. I've listened
to
the
Nothing,
Issues.
the one that we did before.
Yes,
that's the
one
one
from 2019. And so I've been here, I listen to them a lot, and I know everybody talk about that Korn album, and I just never had sat down and listened to it. But I've always seen this image, and I never realized how fucked up that this album cover is until I was looking at it. It's like, good fucking God. Because I like, as an adult, as I am now, like as a teenager, I probably wouldn't have thought nothing about it. Now I'm like, that's horrible. But
Well,
yeah, this was my first.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just saying, like, yeah, this is my first time actually sitting here from start to finish listening to it. And the reason I recommended it for this, we're the theme of albums that changed the landscape of metal or were major in the metal scene. And I just like, what, we should do this album because everybody talks about it as the birth of new metal, and I've never actually heard it per se. So I was like, we're going to do it.
I think that the album cover, and this is the last I guess I'll have to say, unless something springs up from further conversation, is kind of a litmus test. It says, like David said, I mean, I had this album when it first came out too, and I thought, oh, that's a fucked up album cover, but the level of how fucked up it was didn't strike me. And it's not that I have kids now, it's just I know a lot more about the fucked up things that happen in our society than I did when I was 16 or however the fuck old I was in 1994. So yeah, man, this is an album cover that is as shocking and disturbing as any Cannibal Corpse without being as over the top and frankly silly as any of them.
Indeed.
I'm just trying to run through my head of album covers I know of. There's only 2 I can think of that are worse than this one.
Shit.
I can think of 10 others that are worse than this, but I mean, they're intentionally being worse than this because it's like showing somebody who's actually dead on the cover, or a nude underage girl, or
and those are the 2
like
I'm thinking of.
Yeah. So
or your dead friend's head blown up.
Well, that's
yeah.
Okay. Oh,
that's the one he was talking about.
Like
the dead guy, the Prince of Black Hearts.
Or Wake Up and Smell the Carcass, which has that amazing shot of Kennedy with his head open.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I can't say too much about it because we used an image like that on one of our albums one time. So
sure.
But anyway. So yeah. I first heard Korn, and if you've been listening to our audio only podcast, you've heard me tell this story before. But the first thing that I heard was, I keep saying that it was a sampler on one of the game discs that came with the first PlayStation. It might have actually been like a Much Music CD that we got around the same time. I don't remember, or a CD DVD or whatever that had that and like Christian Woman on it by Typo Negative. But either way, it opened up with the opening track of this song, and just because of how detuned they are and the fact that they're playing 7-string and 8-string guitars, and just Jonathan Davis growling in, "Are you ready?" And I have to say, unequivocally, no, I was not ready for what I was about to experience. That was one of the heaviest fucking things I had ever heard to that point.
Fine.
And I mean, I'd listened to Slayer, Megadeth, Metallica, all that stuff, and all that stuff is heavy, and in some ways I like it better, but this was a heaviness that I had not experienced at that time.
I think I encountered this album cover before I encountered the album. I remember kids I went to high school listening to it and wearing Korn t-shirts and stuff like that. But the only thing that I actually heard from this record, intentionally or unintentionally, before listening to the whole thing for this was hearing Blind from like radio play, alternative radio, something like that. Kind of weird. But yeah, it disturbed me back then, and I think it continues to disturb me.
It should. And this is before, the thematics they're dealing with. I don't think it was cliche yet to be talking about this stuff. And in some ways, I think this album anticipates how Gen Z feels about mental health. Because the generation Ben and I came out of, we didn't talk about shit. And so this was really striking to be dealing with this level of, like, Iron Maiden talks about horrible shit, but it's like people getting napalmed in a village. This level of individual trauma was really striking then. And even now listening to it, I'm like, oh my God, the amount of pathos in here that was, I think, even more, I don't know if I would call it revolutionary, but it was not typical of metal.
I do think in some ways that it is revolutionary for the genre. And the thing that immediately comes to mind when I hear this, and as we've said when we've talked about some of the overly violent themes and some of the death metal we talk about, if you go back and listen to like blues music from the 20s and 30s, some of that is incredibly explicitly violent too. But this focusing on mental health, and it could just be a lacuna in my own musical listening, but the thing that immediately popped into mind for me is that first Joy Division album, because that was doing the same thing for punk, and that it was turning it from like a being angry at the state or the conditions and everything, and really looking inward and dealing with your own mental health. So, and not that I was overly familiar with the Joy Division in '94. Again, I'd heard some of it, but it hadn't really clicked yet. And so this was eye-opening in a number of ways.
So I would also piggyback on what you guys are talking about. And I asked myself this question when I was listening to this, to what extent is this album therapy and for whom, right? Like
indeed,
in a sense, and not to like go all, Zennial or Gen Z on everybody, but like to what extent is this actually just triggering and not like sort of re-traumatizing and not really exercising whatever demons, you know what I mean, for the people who are listening. So I could definitely see that as a possibility as well.
Well, I think for the artist, it was extremely, to extent, at least something of getting it out and cathartic. Because I read the Rolling Stone interview that the band members and Ross Robinson gave, and I didn't know it at the time until I read it, that the crying at the end, Daddy, was actually him breaking down during the session while singing the song. And it's just like, holy shit. And so like knowing the background to that and like what it was, you see now seeing the name Faggot as a song title, it's like, really, granted it's been 25 years, but you're still like, or 27 years. I was like, wow, I can't believe this name now. Then you see the background behind of why that song was written. And then you're like, okay, now it makes sense. And it's not, I'm gonna go with, while I'm not part of the LGBT community, I'm gonna go with, I don't think it's offensive in that standpoint of where it is.
I think it really depends on the context. And to Gabe's point about it, whether it's therapeutic or traumatizing, it depends on where you are and where you hear this. Because if you don't hear that context and you hear that, you see that album or that track title, it could be triggering, and I would understand why. If you listen to it and don't really know what it's saying, perhaps the same thing. But also what I want to say is, whereas I think that particular track was probably therapeutic for Jonathan Davis to write, considering it was addressing how, since he was a fan of Duran Duran and wore frilly shirts in high school and makeup and everything, people always accused him of being homosexual and leveled that slur against him. I don't know that Daddy was, because even though he does break down and cry at the end of it, when the interviews that I've seen with him, and I haven't seen the one that you particularly referenced, Tracy, he says that everybody thinks that was because I was abused by my dad. I wasn't. I was abused by somebody else, and I don't want to talk about it. So it was that therapeutic, or since he broke down and is having like really heaving deep sobs that they include on the track to great effect, I add, is that traumatizing to him, or was it therapeutic?
I mean, ask Ross Robinson. That's partially how he works.
Oh, true. Yeah, he has said that he doesn't really care about the sound from a technical standpoint. He cares about it from an emotional standpoint.
Yeah. In terms of where this came from, to get a little bit to the music side, this is our second band that is essentially was spawned by Mr. Bungle. So like Slipknot, they really like Faith No More, but they also like Slipknot, like they literally went to San Francisco just to watch Mr. Bungle play, and maybe Mike Patton wanted to distance himself later, but I think that lineage is clear. The other thing that was Red Hot Chili Peppers, Jonathan Davis himself claimed, and this may be overstating it, that they didn't even quite view themselves as a metal band, but viewed themselves as a funk band. And that's what he said, Ben. He's like, this isn't heavy metal, it's funk.
Yeah, no, I can sort of see that, but I also disagree with it. But who am I to say that?
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far either.
It sounds like funk through the filter of Mr. Bungle.
A bit. And then there's also a lot of reggae. So all that toasting, that what he's doing over the vocal tracks, because he isn't really a rapper, it's not like Fred Durst, but that's called toasting, and that's straight out of reggae. So there's a ton of influence, and this is thanks California. Bakersfield is a complicated place. It's both fairly cosmopolitan, but also a shithole. So
I mean, it's also interesting. You hear Phil talk about. He's like, I hate fucking bass, and he's got one of the most prominent bass sounds in metal that you can think of.
Well, it's interesting because that is a conscious choice because of the fact that they're playing 7 and 8 string guitar. So he has very limited sonic landscape to play with, where you get the distinctive fieldy sound that most bass players I know either love or hate. I like it. I won't say that I love it, but I mean, what he's done is he turned down all the mids, turned up his treble and his bass so that he's operating on the very far low end, and then that ticky tick sound that everybody thinks that, complains about is coming through the horn of his amplifier. It's the high end, and that gives it another element. This is a very rhythmic band. A lot of what David was talking about coming from reggae that Jonathan Davis is doing vocally is a percussion or a rhythmic element. This is another rhythmic element on the multi layers of the rhythms in this sound, and I can see why he does it. I mean, that's a throwback to like the 30s when because of the recording technology, you couldn't get a very good low end. So a lot of the times, and along with the bass, you would have somebody playing a baritone guitar and slapping the instrument, the body of the instrument to get another rhythmic sound in it because you couldn't quite capture the bass tones in the recording technology at the time.
They also credited Cypress Hill. Jonathan Davis said, "No Cypress Hill, no Korn, period." And
I believe that 100%.
I do too, just based on what that area was like in Southern California. And then there's some, we'll talk about when we get into tracks, but there's some straight up hip hop beats happening in a couple, like some of those interludes are essentially just hip hop. He never goes Fred Durst, which I'm happy with. Yeah. But
well, I will say I'm a big fan of Mudvayne's LD50. It's one of my top 10 albums of all time. And hearing this album, I can see the direct lineage of Korn to Mudvayne.
Yes.
In this.
100%.
And just see how much of, especially for Ryan Martinez, how much it was influenced by the sound.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off of what Dave mentioned, Chili Peppers, right? And there's this like perennial debate about like who has the right to do rock and rap and like who actually is doing it and who's just doing it poorly or doing something else. I mean, I think that this band is not a funk band, period. Yeah, I mean, there's slap bass, but that does not a funk band make. There are some, hip hop kind of stuff going on, and maybe it's toasting or whatever, but it's not funk. They're doing a completely different thing. But that aside, I mean, you can still say, Fieldly is doing something unique, right? He's doing something that stands out for this genre of music. You don't hear that kind of slappy, trebly bass in other places. Maybe in other, I don't know.
Primus.
Sorry.
Primus.
In Primus, but of course that they're close.
That's not really metal. That's exactly.
Well, I mean, it's metal adjacent. We'll probably
metal adjacent.
But he's also playing it as a lead instrument too.
Exactly.
Primus, so it's. I mean, because Fieldy is still laying down the rhythmic portion that a bass is supposed to do. It's occupying the normal space that a bass would in a band. He's just occupying a different frequency than is often associated with it, in my opinion.
Yeah, the tone and the playing style is different for sure.
And your point about this being more hip hop than funk, I also totally agree with. I think that this is the most, at least to that point in '94, the most integration of hip hop into metal. Now, we had rap and metal stuff happen. Run DMC and Aerosmith, Public Enemy and Anthrax, but that was metal with a rap section and not fully integrated for an entire track, much less an entire album like it is here.
I think the structure is very interesting. It seems normal to us now because new metal just made it seem normal that a pop structure would have been sort of imported back into metal, but the whole sort of, verse, bridge, chorus. I think that's one of the reasons they were so successful is their songs are relatively short. The structure is pop, even if it's 10 times heavier. And I think for a lot of people, peeling off complicated solos and some of the intricacy that you hear in something like, Justice for All or whatever, I think for young audiences in 1994. I don't think they wanted a lot of that. I still liked it, but I think there are reasons this spawned an entire genre that then dominated for like a decade.
Well, and I think the lyrical content, that emotional content, also touched a spark with a lot of people.
Yes.
For obvious reasons. I mean, I am lucky that my own childhood was nowhere near as traumatic as what Jonathan Davis or perhaps some of the other members of Korn experienced. But in some ways, I'm not the norm. And that's fucking terrible.
It is.
But it does speak to the experience of a lot of fans who weren't getting that anywhere else.
No, that goes for me, unfortunately. There's some of that going on. And he got traumatized all over again as a teenager working in a funeral homes. So he talked about like he was seeing dead children and when he was like 17 working in San Francisco. And he admitted it fucked him up real bad. Like the song Dead Bodies Everywhere, and I know that's a later album, but he himself said he had to do an enormous amount of therapy because it fucked up his sleep for years. The amount of dead people he saw.
Oh, I do not doubt it, because I mean, I've seen, because my parents worked on an ambulance when I was a kid, so I've seen a lot of dead bodies, and it's not something. I mean, I guess you eventually become acclimated to it, but it's not healthy.
It's not.
And also, this is an album that reflects a serious amount of drug use.
It is.
So I think, and probably a lot of that is trying to self-medicate to deal with the trauma. I think he even says as much at later times.
He does. It's one of the first albums I know of that explicitly talks about amphetamine.
Yeah.
Which was relatively new in 1994. It's a thing that was ravaging our cities. Thanks, Bakersfield, for being at the cutting edge. But yeah, that song, Helmet in the Bush, is literally about meth dick.
Yeah.
Which is the scientific term for it. Anyway. So yeah, I think it captured a moment in terms of trauma and alienation and pain that I think other music did that, but I don't think metal did that very well. There are of course exceptions, but like Pantera gets into that space a little bit too occasionally, for some of the same reasons. For some of the very same reasons.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I do think that it's there in certain pockets, but I don't think there had been a fucking hour-long crushing assault of it.
Not like this.
Yeah.
And it's, I would argue well played.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
More than some of the, I think, as you were saying, Ben, implying we should be careful about looking at new metal backwards through some of the later derivative bands that were not as good. Mm-hmm. Or even some of the later Korn. Like I listened to their greatest hits from 2011. And I like Korn, but there are a couple songs there I'm like, oh my God, I'd forgotten about this abomination. That song that he does with Jonathan David, with Fred Durst.
All in the Family.
Is a complete disaster.
Oh, it is, especially now. I've listened to it.
Yes. I had not listened to it in years, and I was super horrified and offended in a way that I was not with anything on here. I mean, there's some things that are problematic, but Jesus. Yeah. Anyway, when they did this, there was new metal. There was just Korn. I mean, it was. That's
true. Yeah, it was kind of its own thing.
It was its own thing.
I mean, it's building off of predecessors like everything does. I mean, Suicidal Tendencies, Indeed. The aforementioned Faith No More, Mr. Bungle, Cypress Hill, which Cypress Hill also starts to incorporate more metal sounds into their hip hop as they go further into their career. Biohazard, some East Coast stuff. But yes, this was in a lot of ways, something very new at the time, and including the inclusion of bagpipes.
Agreed, which was not popular with everyone. There were some fans who were really alienated by that, but others became ride or die.
I think it's a pretty great addition to that song. I think it's a great intro.
I really think that the way that the recording of that song is really cool.
Correct.
The way that they just put the microphone in a doorway and he walked
exactly
by it and got further
and then walked away.
Yeah.
The way it was recorded, between it being outside, which gives it a very different tonal quality, and the fact that they're all playing together, which is not how a lot of these bands we review record. I mean, Jesus, Ben, I guess you were the one in our last episode talking about Iron Maiden recording in 3 different studios because they hated each other.
No, that was
That was
me
Bud.
whenever
Or
I
that
was
was you,
somewhere
Tracy.
in time.
Or you with somebody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but somewhere in time, exactly. This
Or-
album
Pulling a
There's a-
Red Fang and recording drums in a swimming pool.
in a swimming pool, but there's a chemistry here they achieve that is, I think, usually only achievable in like live club shows. I don't
Yeah.
want to overstate that, but there's a rawness to it and a sort of a realness to it. And credit to Ross Robinson for capturing it. Ross Robinson did some amazing work. He did this, he did Roots. I mean, the first Slipknot that we reviewed. I mean, I think even in some ways more than Korn is one who created new metal.
I mean, he did Iowa as well. I mean, he's
Yeah, he
considered
did.
the godfather of new metal.
He should be.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Mm.
All right. So shall we talk about some songs?
Yeah, it sounds like we're there. Anything else to add, Gabe or Tracy? I know Ben and I have been rambling about pain.
I mean, I was fairly surprised with this album, and I want to say I'm in the bag for what I've heard for Korn for most of it. I do think some of their albums do have some issues. Like, I'm not meaning that like with a pun wise, but I do think like the back half of Issues itself is not that great. But I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised by how I felt about this album after hearing it a few times about where it sits in my head, in a sense. That was kind of a little surprising because I was expecting something honestly much more rougher around the edges that you get typically with a lot of like debut albums. But Ross Robinson got what he got out of them and then some probably. I mean, I would be surprised some of the shit he made them do in the recording studio wasn't banned in some countries just to kind of drag that sound out of them. Because it
I don't
sounds
know
like
if it was
he's
on this album. Some of the later ones, because I know that I don't remember which one it is, but there's one where he had Jonathan Davis laying on the ground and he was standing over him with his hands on his back and says, "I know what sound I want to get out of you, and if you're not giving me all you can, I'm going to hurt you." So yeah, that's probably bad. But
yeah.
I mean, in this one, he was just basically probably very taxing emotionally on them because, like, in the recording to Daddy, he goes up to him and goes, "You know what you have to do and what you need to reach to do it. So just do it." And Jonathan Davis did. So it speaks words to your point of the relationship between the producer and band to be able to do that.
I'm sorry, that's abuse.
I don't disagree with you.
Yeah. Like,
I
like reading, like, in this recording session, we did Black Album and this, and reading like the difference methods. Like Bob Rock was I don't want to say an asshole, but
he's a taskmaster.
He pushed them guys to get it. But then you look at what Ross Robinson did on this one, and you're like, holy fuck! Like Bob Rock is a saint compared to what Ross Robinson did on this one.
There's also a difference in that where Metallica was in their career as in comparison to Korn. Because, as much as a breakout album as the Black Album was, there were 2 albums before that had gone platinum. They were a successful band by any metric. It's just they hadn't reached the fucking stratosphere that they really with the Black Album. And Bob Ross said he hated working with them. He used to call James Dr. No, because any suggestion that he would give him before he could get done, James would say no. And I bring that up because... And I don't think Ross Robinson was a very well-known producer. This might have been his first record. I'm not 100% sure. But there's a level of star power between producer and artist that Korn does not have in their relationship with Ross Robinson that Metallica did have with Bob Rock.
Like, I listened to an interview with Ross Robinson on Jamie Joss's podcast, and I think this was his first solo production. He had done like engineering work and worked in the studio, but this is the first time he had hands on the controls in the studio. And you're right when talking about that, because I think at that point in time, going into the studio for Black Album, Metallica had at least hit Iron Maiden levels of success, fame, a knowledge of like within the industry. But yeah,
it sounds good, but it's abusive. I mean, you're all right. Gabe and Ben are both correct.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether the dynamic would have been all that different, even if Korn had recorded this album with some star power behind them. I think, I mean, producers are in a position to push the artist around. I think that's like part
They
of
are.
their job. It's like, and you know, if the artist doesn't do what they're supposed to do, they hear it from the record company, right? Who's paying for it? Unless, you know, you happen to be funding it yourself, in which case you probably don't have a producer in the first place. But
Indeed.
And this one was recorded on $15,000.
so I mean, yeah, like I said, I don't know if the dynamic would have been any different, and still kind of reprehensible.
I mean, the fact that he still treats Korn that way later tells you the answer to that to a certain degree. I mean,
Yes.
he's still doing that shit in later albums.
Yeah.
Oh, totally.
And it says something when Fear Factor's like, we're not working with you ever fucking again at that one album.
Yeah, because he did Concrete, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
Indeed.
he's technically the owner of the album. He won that in court.
Yes.
Well, that's also because he made it sound like a new metal album, which they didn't want. I'm sure that there was some like personality clashes with what he did to them in studio, but that seems to be a much more of the sound thing. And Gabe's right; it is a producer's job to kind of push the artists around and get stuff out of them. But when you are coming at it with a little bit of star power, you might not be able to say no to everything, but you can push back in a way that I just don't feel like Korn could do so on the first album. Was where I was going with that.
That's fair.
Yeah, for sure. One thing also, and this is the last thing I'll say about new metal in general, I know we need to get into songs, but the charge leveled against them that all they do is talk about, you know, their childhoods. One, that was fairly innovative, and two, I don't think that's true of Korn after Life is Peachy. I think the first two albums do that, but then they get into other stuff that's also disturbing and it draws on trauma. But I don't think that charge is actually fair. I think this one in Life is Peachy is still working through. I mean, it's like multiple shit. He gets, you know, assaulted by a babysitter. So that fucking happens. He's getting the shit beat out of him in school. He sees a bunch of dead bodies in his formative teen, like just a bunch of terrible shit happens to him. Yeah. And then at some point we need to talk about Michael and Jerry, but we that weird thing.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
I'd forgotten about that. I'm like, oh my God. Because I'd never listened to that Win as an actual married person. So yeah, let's talk about songs that it should probably be someone other than me.
I'll go. I love Blind as an opener. That is a great opener. And we've, in this recording session where we've done the Black Album, Master of Reality, Power Slave, all of them have had really, really good opening tracks. But this stands fucking shoulder to shoulder and toe to toe with those. Ball Tongue, I also like Clown. Clown might be my favorite song on the album. That is so good. I also like track 6, Shoots and Ladders, I think is fucking great. Helmet in the Bush is good. Daddy, man, that is a great song, but it's a hard listen, which, you know, but it is good.
I'll go next. I agree with Ben. The opening track, Blind, and that Are You Ready? No, obviously, America and the world was not ready for what came afterwards. I really enjoy Clown, and I think in Clown you start to see what a lot of like the band comes in later albums. Shoots and Ladders, I love the addition of the bagpipes there. Faggot and Daddy, it's weird to say I like those album songs, even though for what they're dealing with and with their bases around them. But even then, they're both really well done. The ending of Daddy proper and him breaking down crying, once you find out about that, adds a whole nother like level of emotionality to the song that wasn't there previously.
Okay, so it's really interesting to hear that everybody liked Clown so far, because I had a lot of thoughts about that as one of the tracks that I liked, in addition to Need To. But for Clown, it really stood out to me as a mainstreaming of metal kind of moment, where like it's really more grounded in grunge. It's really, for me, like of a piece with Nevermind and Core by Stone Temple Pilots, and even like Pearl Jam, but like a little bit more on the sinister side of those. And I mean, the tonal palette on that track is just really cool. I also really liked Fake, and I liked Lies as well, which for me is also the heaviest track on the record. Maybe it's not the hardest hitting thematically speaking, but they have those layered vocals that are pretty interesting. That for me, I think is the highlight really there. That and Clown probably.
So I'm going to echo what a lot of you said. I think this opener, the trademark "Are You Ready" really sets the tone and is very effective. I think it's one of them, in terms of new metal, one of the most effective intros, period. Ball Tongue, I really like the backing vocals on there, the bass playing on here. I mean, it really showcases very early how good he is. And I really do like the little tinny hip hop breakdown in the middle, that random thing, and then it just goes away. Need To, that's one of my favorite songs on the album, actually. I really like Need To. Between the groove it has and the vocals are very sort of haunting and hollow and creepy. To me, this is a very quintessential Korn song because it captures not only that heaviness and that groove, but that sort of haunting quality. Clown, I just love the story about the skinhead telling him to go back to Bakersfield and their tour manager knocking his ass unconscious. That's the background there. And then there's that other story about them performing it in like warehouse space in Huntington Beach. And like everyone started gathering, like, what the hell is this? Like, Clown was one of the things that when audiences heard it sort of blew their mind. It was just so different. That descending lumbering riff in it is amazing. And then the little squee breakdown. And then that whole "Clown, you ain't shit" thing, that's toasting. That's like straight out of reggae. Divine picks up the tempo a little bit, which I think was needed. It could have dragged a bit. Track 6, this is tortured new wave youth. I have here, you hadn't heard this in metal. This is more Pearl Jam. So sort of what Gabe was saying, that space, and like Jeremy, it's getting into that, which again for metal was a relatively new thing. My kid really liked Chutes and Ladders. We heard it today. She's like, I want to hear this song again. Between the bagpipes and I really appreciate him sort of excavating the true subterranean horror of nursery rhymes. And those things are a disaster. Whether it's Grimm's Fairy Tales or just all the stuff about plague. And again, there's more toasting on here, the whole knick-knack paddywhack thing, and a little bit of double bass, just the tiniest bit, like comes in and then disappears. There's very little of that on the album. Fake has the most Korn riff in history to me. Like, that riff is such a quintessential Korn riff. And then the bucket snare going on, it's got the phasing too. Lies, exactly as Gabe said, it almost has like a death metal growl in it, that sort of layering that he does that I find interesting. Helmet, oh man, this is the one about methamphetamine is a hell of a drug. It's got a bunch of hip hop in it, and it's a grim ass song. And then Daddy, oh my god, I mean, what can I even say? Holy shit. I too had not realized I hadn't realized how genuine that was. Like, I knew bad shit had happened to him, and I knew about the sexual assault, that we talked about it very rarely, but I didn't realize that take was literally him having a breakdown in that moment. I also didn't really know what Michael and Jerry was. This time I read about it was an abandoned audio recording that Ross Robinson found. Is what that is, of just randos being abusive to each other. And it's an interesting choice, like, to end the album with. And different than how they end other albums. I mean, they do Easter eggs other times, but not this weirdness.
Yeah, I think at the time I probably found that to be more humorous than I do now.
Me too.
Michael and Jerry, because that was also at the time. I can't remember if it was Chaos AD, where you have the hidden track that is basically just Max laughing for no fucking reason. So you had weird ass hidden tracks like that. But that one, it was almost like I'm going to date myself, but it's of the era, a Jerky Boys skit or something. But I don't think it was. I think that was actually an honest to God fight that a married couple was having, who apparently don't have a very good relationship, that they just found an audio recording of. Who the fuck knows?
That's the story, is that it's an abandoned recording. Because at the time I thought it was some weird Jerky Boys type thing. That's exactly what I thought at the time, and just didn't really listen. I just would stop listening to the album before I got to it after having heard it a couple times. But now it's fucking horrifying. I'm a lot more sensitive now and have been in relationships, and oh my god, what a disaster. I mean, it's like the honeymooners, man, and that's not a compliment. or the Flintstones, which is just a watered down version of the Honeymooners.
Honeymooners for kids.
Uh-huh. Blarf. So I guess we got to grade this mofo.
We do.
All right,
Who wants to
Tracy,
fall on the sword first?
you chose it. You do it.
Okay.
That is tradition.
As is tradition. So this album was much better produced and turned out better than I was expecting it to be. I thought it to be much, much less worse quality than it actually was. For that, and for I think this album overall, it deserves a high B plus, a low A minus, like an 89.5, 89, right around in that area. And I think some of their stuff, later stuff, I like much more.
Gabe, what do you got?
So I had a tough time listening to this record, to be perfectly frank. There's a lot of promising stuff about the record. They work really well with dissonance, and they could do more with that. But I just found a lot of it monotonous and not particularly catchy. But there was a few tracks that I enjoyed a lot, and so I would say it's a hard C.
You said C?
Yeah, we'll give it a 73.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a C minus.
On my grade scale, it's still a C.
Indeed.
Yeah, we don't actually have a C minus listed, but we give them all the time. So,
We do.
Ben gives them all the time.
but I'm not going to give one here. I do agree with you that it can be hard to listen to it. It is a bit repetitive, but this is one of those that, having lived through it in real time as somebody who had just graduated high school, and how much that this would influence and change metal as a genre for the next 5 years anyway, if not forever. I'm going to have to go higher than that. And honestly, I like this album. I think that the majority of the tracks are really good. They're different. They might be slightly repetitive, but I mean, fucking AC/DC and ZZ Top made careers out of 3-chord songs that are about the same goddamn thing. So I'm not going to ding them too much on this. So I think this is a great album. I'm going to give it an A minus.
The stars are back in alignment. I'm with Ben. I think this was so important and foundational for so much music that came after it. And I think, I try not to usually talk this way, but living through that moment and this sort of breakthrough to really addressing how alienated and miserable so many of us were, I think it's very important. There are things that could be improved. It is a bit monotonous and sometimes difficult to listen to. I'm going to come in at exactly the same as Ben, at an A minus.
Well, all right. What are we doing next time, Tracy? You're muted.
Muted.
I saw that. But not too late. Next time we are returning back to the 2021 and looking at our picks for July. And the first one on the board is the Divine Horseman, Die Apokalyptische Reiter.
Yep, that's an album that I have picked and I know nothing about at all. So I'm looking forward to listening to it. Other than that,
It's going to be interesting.
So it shall be. All right. Well, thank you, Gabe, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, anytime, my friend. Anytime.
Anytime.
And thank you for listening and watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, or give us a review. And we'll catch you next time here on the Dome Metal Reviews.
Yeah, I picked out the Gates for that one.
And I picked random
King Woman.
doom metal.
Cool. So Ben, when this goes up on YouTube, what are they going to see?